Go ahead and get started. Yes, my mic is on. Thank you very much for choosing to come to our session. I know that you had a choice, as they say on airlines, so thank you for coming to our session, which I don't only think is going to be interesting, I know it's going to be interesting because we've got a great panel of speakers. So this is the session where we're going to talk about the politics of inequality. This is where we're going to talk about how you get delivery on inequality. My name is Elizabeth Stuart, and I'm Head of Growth, Poverty and Inequality at ODI. I should also say that if I see you all using your phones, I'll know, of course, that you're not. It doesn't mean that you're not engaged by this session. It means that you are spending money on your policies and / tweeting. Both of those are allowed activities, indeed sanctioned and encouraged activities. So we're very happy to have you doing that. And this plenary session is also being live streamed as well. So I think we've got a global audience for this session as well. Although sadly, I'm sorry for the online audience, you're not able to give us questions. The Q&A will only be for people in the room with us here in Bonn. Without further ado, let me introduce my esteemed, illustrious panel to you. I'm going to start with Gibril Faal on this end, who is a British Gambian. He's a director of GK Partners, which is an organisation that helps businesses think about socially responsible, social accountability. For this session, though, the reason why we're so happy to have Gibril with us is that he's an expert on migration. And indeed, he presented at the UN General Assembly meeting last year on refugees and migration. So delighted to have you joining us today. Next is Justine Uvuza, who's a senior gender and land tenure specialist at Landesa. And for those of you who don't know Landesa, it's an international NGO that works with government to extend land rights to people who don't have land rights. Justine also, and I think very interestingly for the purposes of this conversation this afternoon, she used to be the head of gender in the Rwandan Ministry of Gender. So again, we're talking about the politics of inequality, a great commentator to have with us on that. Next is Jose Cuesta, who's the head of economic and social policy at the UNICEF Innocenti Research Centre in Florence, and he's fairly recently left the World Bank, where he headed up the shared prosperity and extreme poverty. We've had the first flagship report, and this is going to be an annual report series going on. Next is Patrick Haverman, who is Deputy Director of UNDP China. And then next to Patrick is Becky Millay, who is global co-chair of GCAP, the Global Campaign Against Poverty. You may have seen it says Ricardo Fuentes Nieva from Oxfam Mexico in your programs. He went through passport control. He was about to board and was turned away from the plane at the last minute. So he's very sorry to not be here, but I'm going to cite an Oxfam statistic in a minute, so he's kind of he's here in spirit, if not in person. So I want to give you just a couple of words of introduction to the topic. I think actually the debate on inequality has come an extraordinarily long way in the past few years, and it kind of accelerated in the past few years. So we now have an understanding of inequality as being something that was important. This might sound obvious sitting here now, but a few years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, I think it's fair to say, it's still the case that economists either thought that inequality wasn't particularly important, or they thought that it was inevitable, or they actually thought that it was something good, that it encouraged competition, it was a kind of natural byproduct of competition. That's not the case anymore. We now understand that inequality has pervasive effects. And we have, the IMF now is very clear that reducing inequality improves the quality of your growth and makes it more likely to have sustained periods of growth. And of course, we also know kind of morally and socially, we've seen what's happened, not least in the US, we've seen what happened in North Africa, we've seen even what's happening in Brexit in my country, that there are effects of inequality that we see in our societies, and they're not necessarily good effects. This is a public bad, not a public good. So that's new, that we know this. We also know a lot more about the implications of that poverty in terms of kind of data and analysis. So we have the now famous Oxfam statistic that, as I say, I will quote in Ricardo's place, that 8 men own more wealth than the world's bottom 50%, which is an extraordinary statistic, and it's a statistic that's really caught the public imagination. We also know, thanks to the latest work of Thomas Piketty, that for the last 30 years, the bottom 50% of the population have had 0 income growth, which I think is a pretty extraordinary statistic. But we also know what to do about inequality. We know what the policy solutions and responses to inequality are. So we know this both for vertical inequality, this is income inequality. We know this is about redistribution. We know this is about job creation. We know this is about kind of governments managing their economy and responding to shocks in an appropriate way. But we also know a lot more about what's known as horizontal inequality. This is what the Leave No One Behind agenda of the SDGs is trying to get to. This is the differences between groups. This is that if you come from a marginalized group, if you come from an ethnic or religious minority, if you're a woman, if you're a child, if you're an older person, if you're not able-bodied, that you face these kind of inequalities on a daily basis. And ODI, last year, we did a kind of synthesis of what is the best evidence out there on the policy response to deal with that sort of inequality, this horizontal inequality as well. And we know it was things like improving access to services, health and education, but also connectivity and rural electrification. There's a sort of bucket of policy responses around changing institutions. One of those was women having access to land and having those land rights enshrined in law and actually those laws being implemented. And we also found that there was a sort of packet of measures, sort of normative measures around things like it being expected that girls should go to school. So we know what the right thing to do is, and yet for the past 3 decades, inequality has been rising in advanced economies and in many developing countries, not all developing countries, but many developing countries, which is kind of, I think, the starting point for today's discussion, which is, why is that? If we understand why it's a problem, what to do about it, why isn't that policy response in place? And I think a useful working hypothesis for this session is that it's about politics, that there's a lack of political, not only a lack of political will to do anything about it, but in fact, because of, depending on the sort of political, whatever the political structure in a particular country looks like, it may often be against the direct and immediate interests of the ruling elite to do anything about those policies and to change that income inequality. It could be that the people who have the loudest voices in the country are the very people who benefit most from those inequalities. So that's something I want us to think about today, and as I say, that's a kind of working hypothesis for this session. Because this is a global festival of ideas, we're approaching this from a more positive mindset, and so what we want to do today is be very pragmatic and think and really unpick instances of inequality reducing policies that have worked and understand why they've been implemented. What is it about the political settlement that has allowed the government or inspired the government to pass these policies and start reducing inequalities? It's the how. How has this happened? And that's what I want to think about today. So let me start the questions I'm going to turn to Gibril first, and I know obviously you were going to talk about migration as an inequality reducing policy. I'm going to ask the same question of you that I'm going to ask of all the panel, which is, can you talk, I know you're going to talk about migration in Germany, what have been, if you had to identify 3 political drivers, 3 reasons why in your analysis Germany decided to pursue this policy, can you tell us what those are?
I think the 3 main reasons are, one, strategic, that is the population deficit in Germany. For over a decade now, the European Commission have been telling all its members that they need to plan for the population deficit. But particularly Germany has been far more sort of progressive or at least active than any other country in the EU. So that's the big strategic long-term reason. The tactical reason is labor for medium-term renewal and growth in Germany. There is some suggestions, I've heard it said, that just before Merkel made the decision, she did have some very important meetings with leading German business CEOs, and that was crucial to the decision she made. Then the third one is more short-term, and we must give Germany and Merkel the credit for that, was humanitarian, because there was seemingly a crisis. I call it sort of a so-called migration crisis because it wasn't compared to crisis of migration elsewhere. But the suffering of the refugees and the migrants was real, and her response to that was on a short-term basis. So that, I would say, are the three main reasons why the decision was made.
Excellent. Very interesting. Thank you, Gibril. Justine, if I could ask the same question of you. I mean, I talked about land rights when I was kind of setting this conversation up. And land rights are either something that aren't there in law, or I know there's also a sort of, even if they are there de jure, de facto, they're often not implemented. And yet that's not the case in Rwanda. Now Rwanda's moved from having a patriarchal land allocation system to one that actually explicitly tries to benefit women and girls and female orphans, and has succeeded. Can you talk us through, again, the same question, the political drivers for that, both the law being implemented in 2004, but actually, in reality, it actually having some bite and actually coming into effect?
Rwanda had a unique situation, and some of you might be aware. We had war, we had genocide, we had a history of ethnical wars and cleansing since the 1950s, and land was at the heart of everything. So we had people who freed in the late 1950s and up to early 1970s, who left land, and then we had those people who occupied the land, left by the early refugees. And then after 1994 genocide, we had these people, all of them returning to the country. Rwanda is a very small country, and in the middle of everything, to stabilize the country and to foster social cohesion, land was one of the key things that Rwanda had to address. So one of the key factors was social cohesion and sustainable peace. But also in Rwanda, Rwanda was at the time a very poor country, and most of the population in Rwanda survived on land. It was the only asset that they had. So being the only asset that most Rwandans had, especially in the up country, then Rwanda, to foster its economic growth, then it has also to make sure that land is one of the key pillars of our development. And with that, I think those were the key pillars the three key ones: to foster social cohesion, for sustainable peace, but also for economic development. Mm. Probably we'll talk about the lived experiences of that later. Mm.
Very interesting. So it was, it was a crisis. Yeah. that created the space that allowed the sort of the right sort of political economy to allow it to happen. Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
And then I'll talk about how that translates into the lives of Rwandan women and men.
Thank you. Same question to you, Jose. I know you're going to talk about subsidies, fossil fuel subsidy removal. I think is it on? Do you want to try and see if it's?
Hello?
Yes. It's on.
So I want to talk about subsidies, but before that I want to start off with a kind of linguistic reflection, and is that in my native language we have the same word, which is Spanish. We have the same word for politics and policies, which is políticas, which I think is very indicative that it's not just that politics is a hypothesis affecting policies, is a critical factor affecting policies. And typically when we start to think about or design policies, when we do it in Washington, in New York, in London, in Florence, in all these places, we kind of design these policies almost as in a lab. And even when we think about political economy issues, I mean, they tend not to be really incorporated in the design. So that's the first point. The second point is that even if we were to include those political economy issues from the very beginning, they are really complicated. And I want to make that point with the example of subsidies. Energy subsidies in the Middle East and North Africa region. Subsidies are probably one of the policies most analyzed, at least in terms of poverty and inequality impacts. There is no doubt that they are regressive and pro-rich. Clearly, you're going to benefit more from cheap prices of electricity or gas if you have a big house and you have a car. Poor don't tend to have big houses, and they don't tend to have big cars either. We know that, but the fact of the matter is that in that part of the world, subsidies, in particular energy subsidies, are really part of the social contract in these countries. So for the last 30, 40 years, there has not been really a change in this status quo. However, after the Arab Spring, there was an increase in pressure to different things. One of them was, of course, to bring up more inclusive policies, and also at the same time keep the budgets tight. So we have these two demands, heavy demands. So what different countries did? Did they change subsidies? Very expensive regressive subsidies. And we have here a very rich variation of policies undertaken in this region. You have the experience of Morocco and Tunisia, in which they basically rise up the prices of energy in a gradual way and in a sustained way. So every 3, 4, 5 months they will increase prices by small steps. You have the case of Egypt, in which they went through a deep increase of prices almost overnight, taking advantage of the political situation when President El-Sisi ousted the Muslim Brothers, and there was a very political sensitive time in which basically the trade-off was between well, pay more for your electricity or going into turmoil, even more turmoil. Then you have the case of Yemen, no change at all. The government there is simply too weak to make any transformation at all, any policy change. But then you have this, I think, very interesting case of Iran, of all places, in which they did a very deep change. Actually, they substituted, probably the only country in the region substituting energy subsidies and replacing them for a cash transfer program. Initially it was supposed to be targeted, I think it was universal, it was supposed to be longer term, now it's 6 months, and importantly, the government announced what they were doing, they were to do this, and why they were doing that. So I think it's one of the examples, one of the cases in which we can take the lessons from Iran, for places, and teach us something about how you deal with energy subsidies. Now you have Algeria, probably the latest country coming up with this facing up this practical policy issue. What did they do? What did they learn from the experience of other countries in the region? Well, they went for a very cautious reform. They were thinking first of changing energy subsidies and also staples, food subsidies. They only went for energy. They didn't explain why they were doing that. I think they missed the opportunity to explain why they were doing that. And they missed the opportunity to explain what the experience they had before. Why is that? I don't know. I think it has to do with the status quo and fear to become accountable in the future. Once you explain one policy, you are posting yourself for explaining the other policies.
Great, thank you. And I should say that I don't know if all of that, but at least some of that was an insight from a chapter that was in the World Bank report on the twin goals, and I think for editing purposes got cut because it was too long, but that's an insight into secret unpublished bank report. That you heard it here. Patrick, same question to you. Clearly I'm going to ask you about China, and you know, China is obviously, we know it for poverty reduction, but I'm really interested now that you have the government explicitly talking about inequality reduction. What is it that's driven that decision?
First, thanks for inviting for the panel. It's great to kind of like sit in for Ricardo. He missed his plane. We were like colleagues like 5 years ago. But as well, when I talk to the Oxfam people, kind of like at the country levels, I think as well, it's a fantastic agenda. Kind of driving is inequality. I don't have a favorite out of the 17, but if you say 8 people in this planet have as much as 50% of the rest, you really get the sense of injustice, no? And this thing that it should change, I think. Then another comment we were discussing a little bit at the beginning as well, yeah, with the upcoming artificial intelligence and the next drive of industrial revolution, I think at the planet we really should take a look at this universal basic income. Currently 8 people have everything and a lot of people have nothing. And so from the bottom, I think, as a planet, but I asked a bit in the UN if we already started task forces. I don't know.
You'd be pleased to know that there's a UBI discussion happening at another time. I can't remember when on the agenda, but universal basic income.
So to China, I think the second biggest economy of the world. Now we have a GDP of $7,500. It's in middle income countries. The average life expectancy is 75. Primary education guaranteed. So that's all good, but if you take a look at the progress of the Human Development Index, economical growth has been the main driver, and not that much, a little bit less the education and the health. And so that has risen, the inequality has been risen during this time of economical growth. And so it is all said, there's wide discussions about this difference between rural and urban, between the west of China and the coastal areas, with generational inequality with a very rapidly aging society. And as well, of course, the realization in the society as well that economical growth has really led to like environmental degradation. So I think all these things, so why are we talking more about inequality? I think it's pressure kind of on the government on these issues.
Pressure from whom?
Yeah, I think especially everybody in Beijing is always talking about the air quality. And also, so it's everybody, it's the government as well. So that as well, that the government really realized we need to do something. I think it's on the mind of inequality. Still, the poverty agenda is very, very firm, and I think we think that's it's very good as well. The president has guaranteed that in 2020, or set the goal by 2020, no more poor people at the end of poverty. So 10 years earlier than the Sustainable Development Goals. And we kind of like hope as well. We're working with the government on kind of like a paper. How does the strategy look like after 2020? We hope that then inequality comes firmer, more on the forefront.
Great, really very interesting. I didn't know this is work that UNDP was doing to advise the government on that. That's perhaps for another conversation over coffee. Very interesting. Becky, same question to you. And I know that you have mixed feelings about this particular policy that you're going to talk about, but if you could talk about the CCT for education in the Philippines, and if we just start on this round, why and how it happened, and then we can get to some of the critiques later on.
Yeah, my mixed feelings is actually about the drivers. No? I don't think the government did those policies because they were driven by a need that comes from the ground, or a reality that there are more poor people who are poor than before. But I think my mixed feelings is also about how the government does not respond to civil society demands. But as civil society, we've done a lot of work in terms of looking at inequality, and we actually challenged the government in the development of the post-2015 development agenda to take up inequality as the main issue besides poverty. So when we looked at the programs that the government is doing in terms of addressing extreme poverty, it was really through not huge budget allocations, but because it is a mandate of the Constitution of the Philippines that we've the largest allocation to education, that they're complying. But at the same time, it was very important for the income inequality to be addressed because with the MDGs not being reached, especially on the issue of poverty reduction, there was a huge challenge that was really coming from civil society and not within government. I don't think they're actually sensitized to actually doing this. But they started doing the conditional cash transfers program in 2007 and then implemented it in 2008. Ironically, this was done during the time of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, who was imprisoned for plunder. And obviously, it was a corrupt government that really initiated this. So, so far, when they started it, it was supposed to benefit about 300,000 families. And then now, at the end, it's still being implemented up to now. And I think up to now, there are no clear indications of how people were actually brought out of poverty from that CCT implementation. So it's marred by politics because how the people are selected in terms of who are going to be the beneficiaries are decided by local officials who are close to some people and who are not close to some people, and therefore would not really apply the standards by which the CCT was to be implemented.
Let's come to bottlenecks later, because
Yes.
that is going to be a question I want to ask, sort of,
Okay.
you know, things that stopped a policy from being implemented. But just, can I just bring you back to, I mean, the point you made, this was Arroyo's government who implemented this. What is it that, in your analysis, why? What was the driver to do it then? If it wasn't civil society pressure, it wasn't about reducing inequality, what was it?
Well, I think it was driven by the World Bank and the ADB because it was a loan, basically. So the Arroyo government obviously is a very neoliberal government, like whatever all the rest of the governments now, I mean, in my country, I mean. So it was successful in Brazil, it was successful in some areas, and perhaps it was because we're more Latin than Asian in some ways.
So it was encouraged by
that
the
kind of
bank.
practice was adopted as a policy.
Okay, great, thank you. I should have said as well at the beginning, if any of you want to come in and respond to or make comments on any of the panelists, please do. I want this to be an informal session. Of course, we'll come to the audience for questions later. I'm very interested in, and in fact, this whole conference is about the issue of trade-offs. Ishbel, my colleague, when she was speaking in the opening plenary, she was using the example of, you know, if you're a planning minister or if you're somebody who's in charge with implementing across all the SDGs, this isn't about cherry picking. You're going to have to prioritize, and that prioritization is going to entail trade-offs. And I think this is a really interesting area for us to look at. And I'm going to ask you a question about the trade-offs that your policies entail. But before that, I just wanted to alert you to a report that we're just publishing today. It's a synthesis of the learning from 49 different case studies. And we tried to look at countries, of those 49 case studies, if you could form a sort of fantasy country, we've called this country Progressia, if you could have a country that was actually delivering on the economic, social, and environmental agendas of the SDGs, what would it look like? What would the policy pathways it could have taken, what would they have been? And what trade-offs would have been encountered on the way? I mean, explicitly the report's looking at if you're trying to, at the same time, eliminate hunger, but also deliver on environmental sustainability. If you're at the same time trying to reduce inequality, but also stimulate macroeconomic growth, and if you're at the same time trying to improve the environment, but keep that macroeconomic growth going, what are the trade-offs you have to make, and who are the winners and losers? And I think Progressia is a really interesting way of thinking through some of these issues. So I hope that you'll find it useful and that you'll take copies. as you go. But let me come to the trade-off question. I mean, you explicitly used that term, Jose, in what you were talking about. Do you want to talk about some slightly more broadly some of the trade-offs? I know that tax policy was another area that you looked at in the bank report.
Yes. First thing probably is just to define what I mean by trade-off, what I understand by trade-off. When we talk about trade-offs in policy in the area of poverty and inequality, we're talking about this trade-off between efficiency and equity. Basically, whether a policy is good for growth is bad for inequality reduction or poverty reduction. So I guess the first point is that even if this is a general perception, I think this is not true. I think we have enough evidence and we have enough policies that show that you can, at the same time, be efficient and improve growth and while reducing inequality. Any policy on ECD, on infants, investing on high quality education for girls. These are policies that are not only good for these persons, and especially when they are targeted to the poorest, are going to be equitable, but also they are good for growth, and they're good for growth in the long term, not only just in a short-term perspective. So, of course, there are trade-offs, but these are not inevitable. So that's the first message I want to do. I want to illustrate this point also with tax reform. And now I want to talk about tax reform in Latin America. Perhaps I'm going to focus on one country, Chile. Historically, I want to compare the tax reform that happened in 1991, I believe, just after the return to democracy, and the one that happened in 2014. Same ideology, basically same party, same objective, distribute the gains of growth to more Chileans, and therefore clearly with an equity goal, and very different ways to do it. In the first case, in the 1991, there was a clear consensus across all political parties. Remember, just after the return to democracy, to do this reform in a way that completely separated revenues from spending. So the question was how we can improve, maximize revenue collection, even if this is not equitable, to then use those resources to increase basically social spending. So they designed a reform leaning on VAT and indirect taxes that increased or maximized tax collection, and then they really made a deliberate effort to redistribute to as many Chileans as possible. As many Chileans as possible means that there will be many beneficiaries, not only among the poorest, but also middle classes. The story short is that they reduced poverty a lot. They didn't reduce inequality because they benefited also middle income classes. 2014, very similar objective, also a tough situation with the crisis, financial crisis. What they do? In this case, they embedded an equity objective in the tax reform. So the way you collect, they were to collect taxes already reflected the equity objective. So it wasn't just about getting more taxes, more revenue collection, it was about doing it in an equitable way. So what that means, they also used income taxes, specifically corporate taxes and dividends, which means that when you look at the distributive impact, basically the top 3% of the distribution were those bearing the brunt of the reform. In Mexico, just to make a comparison, in Mexico they did a very similar reform, same objectives in 2010, also with equity, with an equity goal. But here they also, instead of using corporate taxes, they decided to target income taxes, personal income tax. What was the result? It was also progressive in the sense that 40% of distribution, the top 40% of distribution, bore the brunt of the reform. If you compare the two with very similar outcomes or objectives, also outcomes, as I said, they impacted very differently the distribution of incomes. You still say, well, the poor were not affected, that's great. In the case of Chile, it was the top 3% of distribution. In the case of Mexico, the 40%. So you can have the same objectives. You can try to get around this equity trade-off. Still, how you design your policy is going to be essential.
It's a very interesting point. And again, it's something that we, in this report that I was talking about earlier, one of our key conclusions was that in too many instances, governments don't plan for those kind of, don't design their policies deliberatively enough. And that by explicitly doing distributional analysis before the policy is implemented, so you know who the winners and losers are going to be, and you put policies in place to make it up to the losers, that's how policies are going to be effective and have traction and also be inequality reducing. But I mean, Becky, when we were talking yesterday, you were talking to me about sort of some of the trade-offs that implementing this CCT policy involved, and one of them was clearly a financial one.
Well, it's very clear. As I said, CCT is actually funded from debts, no? So we had to contract several $100 million debt. It's $400 million from the World Bank, $405 million from the World Bank, and $400 million from ADB, and that was the first phase. And now we have additional debts of another $450 million from the World Bank from 2016 to 2019, and another $400 million from ADB.
The trade-off is about,
yes, financing.
It's an intergenerational trade-off, isn't it? So someone else is paying for this down the line. Right. Patrick, has this, I mean, do you think that, I mean, Jose was talking about sort of attempts to do, I guess, to achieve the bank's twin goals simultaneously. Do you think there's a trade-off involved? I mean, China hasn't finished with poverty reduction. I mean, urban poverty is now almost eliminated, but there is still significant instance of rural poverty. Do you think there's a trade-off involved between, and as you said as well, the government's also trying to implement better sustainability policies. Are there trade-offs involved, or do you think it's something that the government is going to be able to implement simultaneously and achieving across all three of those agendas?
No, I think it's all about prioritization. I think currently with the slower economical growth and the environment you need to deal with, and poverty and inequality, the basis is still kind of like there is this hope and kind of like the target for like 6.5% economic growth. So that seems to be the top priority. What I said as well, there's always been kind of like China, the goal is the Xiaokang society, the moderate, prosperous society. And so the inequality can fall underneath that. So there's always trade-off between economical growth, environmental impact, and then inequality, I think. At the same time, when I was thinking of other trade-offs as well, it's kind of like in the government itself. I think the central government is really supporting the SDGs. President Xi went to the SDG summit. Premier Li went there. They put it in the G20. We're really happy that the SDGs now went. But it is the coordination between the ministries as well. So there's a bit of trade-off, if you can call it that way, between the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Commerce, the Minister of Science and Technology, and DRC. So we currently kind of like talking about SDGs with 4 different ministries. And then as well the level of action, I think. The real action should take place at the local level. So there's a bit of trade-off, like how much kind of like central guidance and control versus like local action. I think that's also a trade-off. Yeah, very interesting. Yes, that there are different sorts of trade-offs. Absolutely.
Gibril, you talked about, I mean, the sort of personal agency and of Angela Merkel behind this. Did she have to? Was it very politically unpopular? And what did she have to give in return for being able to implement, having the sort of political permissions to be able to implement the migration policy here in Germany?
I would first observe that I spend time in the world of government, business, and civil society. And I think in government and policy, we tend to think that the world is run by policy. And in business, we know that the world is run by practice. Yeah. So the issue of trade-off to me is less what trade-off happens within politics and policy. It's more what happens between policy and practice. That's where the trade-off is. And if you look at the situation in Germany in migration, over 1 million new people coming into the country. irrespective of whatever policy is, it is now reality. It is the practice, and you make do and make the best out of that. Now, my observation as a semi-outsider to all of this area is that there's some fundamentals about policies. That is, in general, policies will be incoherent, in general. Secondly, progressive policies in time will be dropped or reversed. And you don't have to agree with me to adopt it. Because if I'm wrong, you would at least have the joy of pointing to me as to how stupid I am. But if I'm right, it would help you plan better. Now, where we are at now...
So sorry to interrupt, you mean they would naturally fall back without, if you don't keep watering that progressive garden, it's going to fail? Okay.
Especially in democratic situations where there's competition as to what becomes the most important. Strangely enough, it is in dictatorial regimes that you have continuity of policy because one person decides what happens. Now, in terms of what we want to do, progressive things we want to do, I would say 80% should be practice, only 20% policy, especially in the post-2015 era, in the era of Agenda 2030. Earlier on in the plenary session, I think I caught sight of the great Irish diplomat, Ambassador Donoghue,
yes,
was in the room.
He's here, yeah.
Yes, and he co-facilitated both of the SDGs and the Migrants and Migration Summit. I blame him for everything. But the point is, there is nothing we want to do that's progressive that we cannot hang on a policy that exists now. So my statement at the UN on September 19, amongst other things, was that we are over-principled and underperforming. And the thing that wakes me up at night is not policy. I have enough policies. It's about practice and the difficulties of making things work. And I think there's an inherent sort of difficulty we have, is that us who drive this policy and politics, we're not implementers. The greatest implementers are not in the conference hall. In fact, they are running this center. They work in logistics and tourism and transportation. And we need to move, even in our institutions and organizations, and bring new form of talent and skill if we're able to move things towards implementation.
I mean, it's a very interesting point that I think probably leads very well into, we were talking earlier about sort of the women's lived experience of this new legal framework. And as Gibril was saying then, it's about the practice, not the policy. Well, share our conversation with the room.
I do agree. I can't agree more with the idea of practice as opposed to, is it as opposed? No, in relation to policies and laws. And I'm not going to talk about Rwanda alone, but I'm also going to talk about other areas where we work as an organization, Landesa, working on land rights. You find that in most places there are good policies and good laws. And I'm not going to call that, yes, there's trade-offs, especially when it comes to women's rights, especially women's land rights. When you talk about women's land rights, the devil is in the details. And when it comes to dealing with those details, most people sit back and breathe deeply and say, oh, we can't reach that far. It's too expensive. It's too time-consuming. And now we are talking about poverty. We are talking about inequality. I think we need to step a little bit back and think about which people are we talking about? Where are they? How do we reach them? Do we understand their language? Do we understand their experiences? You know, so I just wanted to draw us to that one point. The idea of us taking another step to understand what poverty is really is and where it is and who is suffering it, and then start from there, going upwards. Then most of us who go, just before we reach them, then we withdraw. And that's where the problem is, and that's how long it's going to take us if we don't go into the details. So when it comes to women's lived experiences, like taking an example of Rwanda, Rwanda has done brilliantly well more than most countries. I'm a British Rwandan, and I usually tell people sometimes that I think Rwanda has even done better, because in every situation, we need to consider the context, the country, the situation it's in, its economic capacity, its social capacity, its skills, Considering those factors, I really think that they've done well. But where the problem has come now is in the approach. How do you approach what you're doing? One of the panelists in the morning made a very good point about understanding the language, understanding the lived experience. Unless we understand the lived experience of those people who are suffering inequality, whether it's gender inequality, whether it's political inequality, any sort of inequality, then we are not going to deal with the issues, and we are going to be in a vicious circle of conflicts and other things.
And let's hope, sorry to interrupt you, just to say, let's hope that that's what the Leave No One Behind agenda of the SDGs, along with the idea of the data revolution, that we need to understand, what inequality looks like and where marginalised people are and what they want and need and what they choose and prioritise. Then we can match the policies with the practice, I think. I'm going to open it up to the room now for questions. I'm conscious that we've been kind of talking amongst ourselves for some time, and I'd like to invite you to ask the panel any questions. And I'll take questions in a couple. If I could ask you to introduce give us your name and your organisation, and to keep the questions brief so that we've got time for the panellists to answer. So I'll take one. This gentleman here, please.
Development Studies, and I've been working on the SDGs for the last 2 years, covering almost 15 Asian countries, including China. And the thing which we have been discussing in the last half an hour, I'm quite confused. Are we talking of inequality between the rich and the poor, something which was mentioned about corporate tax and income tax? Or are we talking in the SDGs the inequality between the various disaggregated groups that the SDG has indicated? Okay. What is the inequality between a normal person and a person with disability, racial, and all those things? Now, when I've been working in these countries, and also my own experience in Africa for the UN Habitat, I find no city has ever generated data at the disaggregated level which will give you an idea about what is the comparative inequality among different groups.
Okay, so
now, how can we talk on this? And that is what I would like to hear. Even in China, they said we don't have disaggregated level data.
So question about what sort of inequality are we talking about in disaggregation? Right, we'll come to that. Let me take another couple of questions. You, sir.
Thank you, and congratulations on an excellent panel. My name is Cletus Springer with the Organization of American States. I take the point about the need to focus on implementation as opposed to policies. But I'd want to suggest that there's still a lot of need to focus on effective policies. I think we don't have good policies in many of our countries, and that is the source of the problem. We don't have policies that are integrated. We don't have policies that are developed along participatory lines, and we don't have policies that are action and results oriented.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. It's a very, very good point. You sir at the back in the blue cap.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Edwin Scott Asmoda. I'm a professor of aerospace medicine and community development, and founded the HealthPoint International Corporation, whose policy is to drive in a paradigm shift method ways that will allow the SDG be achieved. Now, my questions are two in these regards. I agree 100% with the first speaker concerning trade-offs on policy and politics. I absolutely agree with him because the concept of practice overrides policy.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can I hurry you to your question?
Right. Okay. The question I'm asking him is that how will you control impunity which is involved in practice?
Okay, question about impunity.
As we see it.
Okay, very good question. Let me take one more from this gentleman with the fantastic hat on, if I may make so bold.
All right, thank you. For me, I think it's not a question, but just the input, because we have been following up your discussion. If we want to really try to understand what we are doing, I think there is a lackage of understanding between economic development and economic growth. So the SDG goals, as I have since morning, we are trying to articulate these goals and economic growth. It doesn't work, because when you talk about the economic growth, you are talking about, I mean, the goods, the total goods and services produced within the economy. And when you talk about the economic development, now you are touching about the education, you're touching about the quality of life they live, you're touching about health. And this issue, especially those developing countries, they fail to understand which measure they should take, whether it's economic growth, which is measured by GDP, or economic development. I mean,
okay.
One second.
The trade-off between, can you do those two things simultaneously?
Yeah, the trade-off is that, because I don't understand if that the trade-off that those developing countries are trying to enforce, developing countries to use economic growth as a measure of development. Right. I don't understand.
Okay, another excellent question. Thank you. So I'm going to come for another round of questions in a minute. So I will definitely come back to you. I'm sorry, I'm going to use my chair's privilege to answer the first question. If anybody else would like to follow up, please do. But I think there's a quick answer, which is that the SDGs are talking about both. So it's talking about the income inequality, which is covered in SDG Goal 10, but then this horizontal inequality, the group-based inequality, which is where we need the disaggregated data. It's critical for inclusiveness, Goal 11. But it's also talking about the leave no one behind agenda, which is the group-based inequality, and that's where the discussion about the disaggregated data sits. Feel free, anyone else, to jump in if you want to add to that, but I think that's a sort of definitional question. So coming back to, I mean, there's a couple of interlinked questions, aren't they? Do we have the right policies? Is it a paucity of policies that or the quality of policies are wrong? So kind of, I guess, a challenge mainly to you, Gibril, and then a question about, you know, if GDP growth is still our key metric by which we judge progress, how are you going to also is it the right metric, and how are you going to deliver on the rest of the agenda? Let me start with you, Gibril, and then if anyone else wants to jump in.
There's a trick question asked to law students first day in law school, and that is, what is a crime? And the clever ones would come up with philosophical answers as to what is a crime. And the answer is a simple one. A crime is whatever the law says is a crime. Full stop. A policy is whatever the policymaker says is a policy, including, that is why we have policies inbuilt into it, impunity. So everything bad we can imagine can be in a policy and have been seen in policies. But you also have everything good you can find in a policy can be there and will die for want of implementation. So practice, without any doubt, is what drives things. I would say it's still a trade-off. I would say 80-20. So I'm not going to say let's not do any policies anymore, but I'm saying 20%, 80% the implementation. And if you link that to practical questions of inequality as migration, which I'm answering, some may even doubt, is migration a question of equality or inequality? Well, decades ago, the Canadian-American economist J.K. Galbraith told us that migration is the oldest strategy against poverty, that uplifts the person who migrates and develops the community to which that person goes. We have seen in recent times, 15 years ago, as recent as 15 years ago, if you're talking of countries you have to be alert to, citizens of whom are likely to be trafficked people, on the top of the list would be China. Today, almost every European country have changed their laws to make it easy for Chinese people to come in. And part of the reason is GDP, is because people in China and the country have become wealthier. So on the migration question, is it an issue of inequality? Definitely yes, because I don't know of any country in the world that is against migration. Maybe North Korea. You have to name very few. I don't know of any. The countries that purport to be against migration, it would take me 5 minutes and I would tell you how to buy a passport in that country. And it's published data. If you have money, you can migrate. So the question of migration, most countries, what they don't like poor migrants, they don't like disadvantaged migrants. And that's a question of equality.
And migrants of different ethnic, racial origin as well. But I mean, it's definitely, that's
a marginal issue.
Yeah.
That's a marginal issue. If you are of different ethnicity and you are wealthy and privileged, you can buy a passport.
You can come in. Okay. Yeah. Very interesting. Yes, please.
I'll talk about gender inequality. I think for gender inequality, you will need 50-50 for policies and for implementation, really. It's hard to implement gender equality without policies, and this is the experience of Rwanda. Rwanda started from laying the ground of law and policy to give women, for example, land rights to inheritance, to land just as men. Or else, how do you claim it if you don't have it in the law, if it's not backed by the law? But again, when it comes to implementation, there is also the culture, the attitudes, that patriarchal ideology that, is such a huge thing that prevents women from attaining those rights. And then that also, so it's a combination of approaches for most.
And how quickly can that be changed, do you think, that normative framing?
It takes a while for, how can I say, for having women in politics, having women accessing their rights, an educated woman like me. It's quick because you can claim the law, you can claim the policies. But for the rural communities where the most poor, the people suffering that inequality live, it's hard because they are not aware of their rights, And even if they are aware of their rights, sometimes the policy implementers are against them because they are so far from the reality of implementation of the laws. So like the gentleman there says, I think, but one thing with the policies, again, as a Rwandan, policies can also be used for inequality. Rwanda used to have policies where education, everything was not about one's talent and abilities. It was about your ethnic group. So if your ethnic group is 1%, only 1% from that ethnic group could access education. So again, policies can be used against certain groups of people. So there is need to have that organic, evidence-based kind of policies and laws that will address the situation. That's what I want to say. So for some situations, you need to take a holistic approach to inequality.
And I mean, just on this question of do we know enough about what is good, what makes good policy on inequality? I mean, I started out by saying we kind of do know what's needed. Would you agree with that?
I do agree with that. Actually, my take on this 2080 discussion is I think we know more about the policies that work at the design level than about what works on the ground at the implementation level. So I think we have enough evidence that cash transfers work to reduce poverty and inequality. We know that. What we don't know so much is to what extent is conditioning or not conditioning the cash what makes a difference. To what extent is just transferring the money to the woman, to the female of the household? Or what about if you change the design and you give some portion to adolescents, for instance? We don't know what happens when you give the transfer within the household. These are the things that we don't know on the ground. Having said that, I believe that we have enough good evidence, rigorous evidence, and compelling evidence to say that we know what are the policies that work for reducing inequality, including growth.
That's right, and I guess that speaks to your point, Becky, about it wasn't clear that it was the right people the basis on which people were being selected to be beneficiaries of the cash transfer. It wasn't clear that there was a rigorous process. It was a process of patriotism rather than...
it's patronage politics.
Rather than
and it runs through from the highest to the lowest government. But I want to speak to the topic, on the topic of incoherence of policies. I think inherently I agree with that observation that there is really very much of the incoherence of policies. For example, in my country, you do all the CCT and you do all these things that make people get access to education, to health, and all of those things. But the real government policy in terms of making growth possible would be focusing on deregulation of markets. So we are not even a member of the TPP, but we want to be TPP. Okay. Can you imagine? And
do you think then, I mean, you're kind of broaching on a response to the fine-hatted gentleman over there, which is, is GDP growth then, do you think it is commensurate to be also these other forms of progress which have been set out in the SDGs? Are they achievable all at the same time?
My country has 7% increase in GDP, I mean growth, no? Sustained. 6.1, then 7. So it's quite high, it's even higher than China. I mean, in the last so many quarters. But inequality itself is very evident because you see the gap between the rich and the poor, the income inequality is getting bigger and bigger. There are only 40 people who control the entire economy of the Philippines, and it's because that is allowed by government policies of deregulation and all of this privatization. And we have the highest privatization, we have the highest amount that we pay for electricity and water in Southeast Asia. So how do people get out of poverty when the essential services are privatized, not regulated, and environment is raped, in fact, because extractive industries are allowed, and they have 20-year tax holidays.
So your answer to the question would be
yes,
no,
those kinds
basically
of incentives exist.
You can't do them all. Yeah.
So it results to a lot of environmental degradation, the loss of people's livelihoods, especially in indigenous communities. So these are the problems that exist.
And that it's mutually exclusive.
Yes, and you get to elect a person like Duterte.
Yes, well, yes. Okay, let me take another round of questions. There were hands up there. Lady in the front row with the white sweater.
Yeah, thank you so much for all your insights. It's very interesting. So coming back to the Oxfam report, wherein 8 people are as rich as 3.6 billion in the world, we're focusing on ending poverty. But I'm wondering if, on the other hand in hand, we should also end extreme wealth. So are there any efforts being done? Especially now we see you work on 8 people only, but on the other hand, now ending poverty is focusing on billions of people.
Another great question. Thank you. Gentleman here. And sorry, remember to give me your name and where you're from.
Thank you very much. I'm Ziaur Rahman and I'm representing Pakistan Development Alliance. I hope that my question would not be considered as an offensive, because I think that it's really difficult to tackle inequality if we are unable to listen to the marginalized voices. One. But when it comes to the policies, the people who are living in North, we have different policies, and the people who are living in South, we have different global policies. Why I'm saying this, because the opportunities that are being given to the people who are living in North for the production, investments, and for the access to the markets.
Can I ask you to keep saying what you're saying, but turn it into a question?
Oh, yes, I'm just turning it to the question. Those investment policies, the opportunities, access to the markets are different. Whereas for the people who are living in South, the investment policies, the access to the markets, in the name of GSP Plus and so many other new things are different. My farmer is not getting any subsidy in South where the people are really starving, where the food is really necessary, whereas in North, the farmers are getting high subsidies where people have started dieting already. So it actually enhances the inequality.
So what would your question be?
So my question is that I think we need to have a coherence in policies everywhere.
Right, and how do we get that policy coherence, so I can paraphrase that, if I may. Woman in the peach-coloured top.
Hi, Anna Sellers from CTA in the Netherlands. I just wanted to ask, to tackle inequality, should those that policies are designed in the interest for be more included proactively in policy making rather than just reactively in holding policies to account? And if so, how?
Okay.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Right, I'll turn these questions to the panel. So, Patrick, interesting question. I mean, extreme wealth in China, are there any efforts to deal with that, or is that not on the agenda?
No, I love your question. More from a personal standpoint, I don't think the UN is working on any extreme wealth, but I think as a world we should start tackling that issue. But I mean, it is, yeah. The current environment in the world is as well not that conducive now, that we have one president who kind of like doesn't like big governments, and I think really that needs regulation, that there need more regulation to avoid this extreme wealth, and there should be some kind of like distribution of wealth. On that one, I think the gentleman from India from the last round of questions, measuring the SDGs, measuring inequality, I mean, that's urgently needed. If I took a look, and I did some studies on the MDGs, if you took a look at all the measurements, there was so many data missing. And so it's really, we better have a good estimate than an empty cell. So don't let the cells empty. Measure every of these indicators for every country, every year, and then you can measure progress. But I mean, again, the UN cannot do it because it's not an official UN statistic. And so both of these things, I think, should come from the academia, should come from the civil society, proposals to end extreme wealth, I think.
Jose, has the bank looked at the issue of extreme wealth?
I don't think so. I think the bank, yeah. They are sort of struggling to measure better how much of the income share goes to the top. We don't have that. We don't have statistics. We have a few studies in a few countries, and of course, Piketty's work. But just imagine, I mean, we couldn't provide a figure on inequality for the entire country for about 150 countries in our report. Just a figure. Forget about just getting that number for the top 1%. I mean, we are simply not there yet. We're not there yet. What I think is important, I mean, the sort of policy side of the question is how much is the appetite for real redistribution, from taking from the very top to the bottom. And you can improve your distribution without having to redistribute, so different ways. But the question, I think the important question here is to what extent we have an appetite for redistribution. And I mean, different people have very different appetites. And if I can also address the other question on including in the design and implementation the very poor as well. I mean, I think one of the key reasons, if not the key reason why there is this disconnect between knowing what policies work at the design level and not being so sure about at the implementation level is precisely because we are missing that part of how the beneficiaries, react or behave or benefit from those transfer policies. I think, and there are attempts to directly ask the beneficiaries what they think, what they will do. I mean, we cannot reach them all the time systematically. There are increasing attempts to understand also social norms. So how our policies will change culture, the way society thinks or behaves. And what I think really where we are missing is in understanding the psychology of beneficiaries as well. Just to give you an example, we have no idea of aspirations. We were talking this morning about children. We have no clue about aspirations. We have no clue how our policies, even if they reach them, how they will affect aspirations, how will that change over the life cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Justine, let me turn to you and ask, when you were in the Ministry of Gender, were attempts made to include the views of women and then maybe marginalised women in policy making? Was that something that was attempted, and did it succeed?
Yeah, that actually did succeed. And again, when we talk about trade-offs, Rwanda, like when Rwanda was tackling the problem of gender inequality, let me focus now on women and decision-making, which is also comes from the broader inclusiveness of the different categories of Rwandan community, coming from a genocide and ethnic divisions and that kind of thing. So, yeah, we tried to include all the women. For example, bring women from the rural communities into the parliament, even though there's been a lot of criticism that those women are there and they are not substantively representing women or doing something. These are the trade-offs. You bring them in, but you have also to accept that time when they are not able to participate at the level of the men or the educated women, the highly educated women in parliament. So it was successful. Women in the rural communities were tapped in not only to participate in political, formal political governance at high level, but also in their communities. We have more than 40% women participating in local governance, and then we have 64% in parliament, and which brings women from all sorts of walks. So it was successful, but in terms of that substantive part of what they bring to the table for a certain period of time, then that's a trade-off. Yes, they are coming, they might not be able to participate at that level, but time will come, either them to learn or the young ones who look at them as role models. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We don't have that much longer left. And there's a couple of questions that we haven't necessarily answered, and also not every panelist has responded to every question. So what I'm going to do is, I have one final question for each of you, and if you could maybe answer that, and if there's anything else you wanted to add to any of the audience questions as well. And my final question is, back again, I guess, to the original discussion for this panel, which is the kind of the how. I mean, as you were saying, we don't know. What's really important is how these policies land and how they actually get implemented at the ground level. Are the policies that you've talked about that have been more, or in Becky's case, not so much successful in reducing inequality, are there lessons which are scalable or that can be applied to other countries, do you think? Or do you think these were unique to Germany, Rwanda, the various countries you talked about, China and the Philippines? Is this such a politically driven conversation that you can only talk about a specific national or subnational context, or are there lessons that we, as I say, that you can transfer? So let me start with Becky this time.
I come from a very civil society perspective, and therefore my answer to the question would be really a combination of resistance and engagement. I think we have to organize in different ways, offline, online. We really have to organize, because all of these inequalities are a result of power dynamics that have allowed us to be, more unequal, that have allowed communities and societies to be more unequal. So I think we should focus on opposing policies, not because they're there, but because we feel that inequality shouldn't happen anymore and it should be addressed. In fact, in the SDGs, I feel very uncomfortable that we're going to review in the voluntary national reviews 1, 3, 6, 5, all of these things. And then the last to be reviewed would be inequality, which is number 10. I think it should be the first one to be reviewed because it talks about the whole context of the world. So there's inequality in power, there's inequality in economic, there's inequality in the pursuit of, all of the goods, the social goods that we aspire for. But there's an amount of resistance that is there that has actually resulted to populist leaders being elected in power. And how do we deal with this? So we have to resist. We have to engage, but at the same time, we have to resist.
Okay, Civil society action is your scalable lesson. Patrick, I mean, obviously the world looks to China as to see what lessons can be reaped from the Chinese experience and applied elsewhere. If it comes to inequality, do you think it's unique to the specific polity of China, or do you think it's...
Yeah, China is really a unique country now with 1.3 billion people and such a huge surface. China is really proud about the poverty reduction lessons. But we're struggling. We're doing like South-South cooperation, and other countries are coming to take a look at China of how did it work. But it's really difficult to summarize. So there's a lot of like Chinese characteristics. So I don't come up with one which you really can kind of like copy and paste in another country setting, I think. If I have the mic as well, on the inequality part, I think the question from the gentleman from Pakistan, but yeah, it's a bit of a weird time in world history to talk about it, but what about this whole solidarity principle? So I will say if the rich country pays 0.7 of the GDP, the middle 0.5 and the poor 0.3 to make the world less unequal, but I don't think this proposal really flies at this moment. And the same for corporate social responsibility. I don't know exactly what is the experience in India, but why don't we say that out of your profit a certain percentage you need to give to corporate social responsibility, to just leave it open to the goodwill of the CEO or the goodwill of a certain government. And so yeah, certain more rules that we force countries and companies to deal with inequality, I think would be good, but it's a weird time to talk about it.
Great. Jose?
Well, I think it's, of course, extremely difficult to generalize, but I'll say this. I think we won't see a deep, large and sustained reduction of inequality in the world until we don't agree, and there's a consensus, both global and national, of what level of inequality we are comfortable with. This is exactly the same as with poverty. 30 years ago, there was no consensus of the level of poverty we wanted. Right now, no one will doubt that the lower the better, and actually the objective is to eliminate poverty. We are simply not there yet in terms of inequality. And this one may be more difficult to agree on a consensus, but until we don't get to that level, I don't think we'll see the kind of improvement we started to see in terms of poverty reduction in the last 20 years.
I'm very interested to see as well whether that in itself, whether there could be a sort of global consensus, whether as a national, whether you have to have sub-national ideas of what's acceptable, which is, in itself, no, certainly not. Justine.
Thank you. I'll go back to what I said in the beginning. I think we need to redefine who we are working for. We need to go back down there to the poor people, understand their language, understand their lives, work for them and work with them instead of taking the language to them that they don't understand. I'm saying this because I work for an organization that's passionate about rural farmers' land rights, and we don't seem to be reaching there. And what does this require? It requires policies, it requires practice, but it also requires resources. I think we are more limited by resources. Once resources are allocated to reach that far, where the poor are, where those who are marginalized are in the community, whether it's the disabled, the women, the squatters in some languages in the countries where we work, where people have been in places for 100 years and they are not accepted as landowners. They are considered as squatters in certain communities. Once there's no resources to tackle those, then it's going to be very difficult despite the will and rather the policies. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And Gibril, at a time when it seems that pretty much every country I can think of in the world, with the exception of Canada, is trying to reject and reduce and limit the number of migrants rather than follow the example of Germany, is there something we can take from the political discourse that led to Angela Merkel's decision that you think could be a takeaway for other countries?
Yes, I think so. And that observation, to my mind, does not apply just to migration. It applies to policy and the SDGs in general. And I'll make two observations relating to that. Instead of policy coherence, I think we should focus on policy plurality, because the smartest of policymakers and the most dexterous of practitioners put together will still not have a perfect solution. So the only way is plurality, so that we are able to try out different things, and different parties and different sectors of society can also try out different things. That's the first observation as a general observation. Second is what I call the hyperactivity of the devoted. Those who are doing things that generally is good and progressive, let them be hyperactive in doing it. If I take today, most of us, our lives are being now controlled by smartphones. There were no evangelists going around telling us how we should convert our lives into that of smartphones. What happened was the hyperactivity of the devoted. People who believed in smartphone technology and made it real and thereby determined how we live our lives. It's the practice. It is what's happening right there. So if Germany is doing something, if Canada is doing something, if Rwanda is doing something that is generally good, let them be hyperactive in doing it. And I tell you something else. In the doing, that is far more eloquent than in the talking, because people are more likely to copy it because they see it working. Last observation is the big questions being asked in this room about inequality. I think the prognosis of it is a bad one. I agree with what's been said, because it is likely that the more, as things are now, the more I think we will reduce poverty, but in the process we would increase inequality. Why is that so? It's because the fundamentals of economics have not been challenged yet. We have seen an information revolution that have changed the nature of production. The last time the fundamentals of economics was challenged, you have to go back almost 200 years. If you take these 8 people who are the richest, 250 years ago, the richest people would have been monarchs, political power, absolute power. They control land, so they control surplus. Industrial revolution gave us the capitalists, who owners of capital, they control surplus. So the big industrialists became the richest people. Now, for the past 150 years, it is the era of the capitalist stroke entrepreneur. These are the two who own surplus. And that is why if you have a startup, information age, today you are a pauper, you are living in a student squat, and tomorrow you are a billionaire because all surplus goes to you. This fundamental architecture have not been challenged either by policy or practice. It is possible to challenge it because we saw the change from the monarchs and the aristocracy owning land and owning surplus to the capitalists, and we saw the growth of labor and organized consumption through the cooperative movement. And the cooperative movement became industrialists and influenced what became responsible business. Unfortunately, for the past 100 years, there has been no major thinking and no major innovation. Corporate social responsibility and all that are marginal. They don't go to the heart of the matter. And if I had anything to say about it, the next major debate is about changing the architecture of economics and global finance. Thank you.
Thank you very much for finishing that. And I was just going to say that feels like, you know, that's the next place we need to start taking this discussion. And it is at least being questioned, I think, by more mainstream thinkers. You know, 10, 15 years ago, it was the CSOs who were raising this issue and saying that our current economic structures are not sustainable. It's now become, you know, Larry Summers now says this, it's now become mainstream thinking. So maybe we'll invite Larry Summers along to our next conversation. Talking of smartphones, we're going to have a smartphone-related intervention in a minute, but before then, can I thank this excellent panel very much for all their thoughts, and can I thank the audience, you, for listening and for your questions as well. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, you want to?
I have one question.
Oh, I'm sorry, it's related to the panel.